Hey everyone, welcome back. I think a lot of us when we think about the French Revolution,
Hmm.
we get this instant image in our heads,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah, for
it's
sure.
almost like a movie scene,
Yeah.
like shadowy figures huddled around this kind of menacing machine. The blade falls.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the guillotine, of course.
Yeah.
It's such a powerful symbol. But is it just about terror? Or is there more to it? Well, today we're going on a deep dive to find out.
Hmm.
And I think you'd be surprised by what we uncover. So make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our future deep dives.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head when you said the guillotine is more than just a tool of execution. It's like it
Yeah.
reflects all those contradictions of the revolution itself. This mix of horror and, would you believe it, enlightenment.
Hmm. That's a really interesting way to put it. And for me, it's like whenever I think about the French Revolution, especially from our perspective,
Yeah.
the guillotine just pops into my head.
Right.
And I think Charles Dickens had a lot to do with that. The Tale of Two Cities. He really cemented that image. But what always gets me is how long the guillotine stuck around in France.
Mm.
Like it wasn't just a revolution thing. It was used for way longer.
Absolutely. It was seen as this efficient and even, humane way to execute people.
Right.
It's hard to believe, right, when you think about all the mass executions. But get this, the last public guillotining in France, 1939.
Wow. 1939. That's crazy to think something we connect with the 1700s was still being used so close to, when some of us were born, and it went beyond France too.
Yeah, you're right. Other countries were inspired by the revolution, and they adopted the guillotine too.
Huh.
They saw it as this weird mix of progressive and barbaric.
Like it's almost hard to wrap your head around that.
Right.
Okay, so we tend to think of the guillotine as this symbol of revolutionary bloodlust,
Yeah.
like that's the image. But was that thirst for violence already there even before the guillotine? Like were they just waiting for the right tool for the job?
That's a great question, and the answer is a big yes. The French Revolution didn't invent the desire for revenge or the use of public violence. I mean, as a way of,
Yeah.
cleansing or something. That stuff was already deeply embedded in French society. It was a legacy from the Ancien Regime, the monarchy before the revolution.
So even before the revolution, they had executions and public punishments.
Oh, yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about punishing criminals. It was more like a big spectacle full of moral meaning. Like they wanted to publicly get rid of evil and show everyone that the social order was still strong. It was almost like
Oh.
a passion play or something. The condemned person's journey to the scaffold was full of symbolism and religious meaning.
So the executioner was more than just a state employee then. It sounds like it was like almost a ceremonial role.
Exactly. Under the monarchy, executioners were these strange figures. They were outcasts. They had to live in separate communities, almost like certain religious minorities or people with leprosy. Their touch was both feared and strangely revered. Can you imagine? And they couldn't even buy groceries at the market with their bare hands.
Wait, what? So how did they shop if they couldn't touch anything?
Okay, picture this. The executioner, dressed in his official blood-red coat, walking through the market and using a giant tin-plated spoon to pick up his goods.
Oh.
It was this weird mix of authority and being an outcast.
That's a crazy image. And so their job wasn't just, doing executions right. They did other kinds of punishments.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They were in charge of everything from branding and whipping to getting people ready for galley slavery. It was this complex profession tied into the whole justice system.
Huh. Interesting. Now, if you compare those French execution rituals, what they did in England,
Mhm.
it seems like the English ones were more like
Yeah.
a carnival, like festive sometimes.
Mhm.
So was there like a different vibe at these events in France?
That's a good point. In France, executions were definitely more somber and had more religious meaning. They reflected those Catholic ideas of penance and, being forgiven. Yeah, they were public spectacles, but they also had this deeper moral significance, this idea that they were publicly purging sin.
And you mentioned earlier that there was this one particular execution in pre-revolutionary France that really showed this mix of spectacle and brutality.
Ah, yes. The execution of Robert Francois Damien in 1757. Damiens was a servant who tried to kill King Louis XV. And the punishment they came up with for him, well, it was supposed to be the scariest and most morally instructive thing anyone could imagine.
So it wasn't a quick death. It sounds like it was something else entirely.
Oh, it was truly gruesome. Damien's execution was planned out so carefully, and it had the public on the edge of their seats for weeks. It was like waiting for a big sporting event today. And the actual execution, it was this drawn-out ordeal meant to shock people and make anyone who even thought about challenging the king terrified.
Okay, so how bad was it? What did they actually do to him?
They started by burning his hand with sulfur. Then they used these hot pincers to tear flesh from his body.
My God.
Then they poured molten lead and boiling oil into his wounds, and after that they castrated him and then drew and quartered him with horses.
That's hard to believe that was considered justice even back then.
I know, right? But believe it or not, this extreme act actually led to people starting to think differently about public punishment. Even some people within the ancient regime itself started to wonder if this was really the best way to show justice.
So even people who weren't revolutionaries wanted to see reforms and a more humane approach to punishment.
Exactly. Thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau, who, were famous for criticizing the ancient regime, were also big advocates for penal reform. Their ideas really resonated with this growing feeling that something had to change.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that future revolutionary leaders like Robespierre and Brissot were against the death penalty even before the revolution started.
Oh, absolutely. It shows how consistent their beliefs were. They saw these brutal executions as symbols of everything wrong with the old system. And that anger, it fueled their revolutionary ideas. They used the memory of those horrors to get people on their side and build support for change. It's important to remember that the revolution wasn't just about violence and overthrowing the government. It was also about reform, about creating a fairer society.
Right, and this is where Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin enters the story.
Exactly. Guillotin was a doctor and a really passionate social reformer. He was all about improving the lives of the poor and disadvantaged. And he wanted to abolish the death penalty completely. But he knew that wasn't going to happen anytime soon, so he focused on making executions more humane and standardized for everyone, regardless of their social class.
So he's the one who came up with this simple mechanism for beheading, the machine that would eventually, kind of ironically, be named after him.
The irony is amazing, isn't it? Because at first, his proposal was a total joke to the public. People thought a beheading machine was so outlandish it was almost funny. They even started using the word guillotine as a way to make fun of him.
It's wild how a word that started as a joke became a synonym for one of the most infamous devices in history.
It really shows you how unpredictable language and history can be. But even though people were making fun of him, Guillotin's ideas were actually pretty radical for the time. He was trying to balance this desire for spectacle with a more humane form of punishment.
So basically, the revolution turned the executioner's job into something more normal. Like they went from these mystical figures to just regular state employees.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The revolution wanted to get rid of all the superstition around executioners and make executions more standard, less ritualistic. But even that change caused a lot of debate.
Because they didn't get rid of the death penalty right away, did they? There were all these arguments about what to do with it.
You got it. In 1791, there was this huge debate in the National Assembly about getting rid of the death penalty completely. Robespierre was actually a big supporter of abolishing it. But in the end, the Assembly voted to keep it, which I guess shows the limits of how far they were willing to go with penal reform.
Yeah, so even with all this talk about progress and enlightenment, they couldn't quite let go of capital punishment.
It's a good reminder that revolutions, even when they're driven by these ideals of progress, are often messy and complicated. Things don't always turn out the way you'd expect. And in this case, they decided to go with beheading over hanging as the preferred way to execute people. It's like they were extending this privilege that used to be just for the aristocracy to everyone.
A very egalitarian approach to capital punishment. But I imagine doing mass beheadings created a whole new set of problems.
You're telling me, think about all the logistics and the potential for things to get really gruesome. It wasn't just about one execution at a time anymore.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And this is where Charles-Henri Sanson, the former royal executioner, spoke up. He pointed out how much skill beheading required the problem of the blade getting dull after being used so much, and most importantly, the sheer amount of blood involved in doing so many executions.
He was worried about the blood?
Not because he was squeamish or anything. He argued that all that blood would scare the people waiting to be executed, and that it would ruin any moral lesson they were supposed to learn. Plus, it would make the whole event less dignified. Remember, they created the guillotine to make executions less gruesome than what the monarchy had done.
It's a pretty dark point, but I get it. They were trying to make executions more controlled, less overtly violent. Exactly. So the National Assembly, with all these practical and philosophical concerns, they decided to bring in a surgeon, Dr. Antoine Luby, to help design a more efficient beheading machine. It wasn't just about finding a way to kill people quickly, it was like a science project, trying to find the perfect balance of speed and what they considered a humane execution. Dr. Louis was really thorough. He studied everything about beheading, the perfect angle for the blade, the structure of the spine. He wanted to make sure it worked every time so no one would suffer.
So it sounds like he was treating it like an engineering problem almost, like he was designing some new kind of machine.
That's a good way to think about it. He even brought in a German piano maker, Tobias Schmidt, to help him build the first one.
Oh, wow.
Schmidt was a real craftsman. His skills were important for making sure the machine was precise and reliable.
And of course, they had to test it out before they actually use it on a person, right?
Absolutely. They did a ton of tests, first on animals and then on corpses. They kept careful records of everything. And Dr. Louis was pretty happy with how efficient it was and how quickly it could cause a supposedly painless death.
It's a weird thing to think about, but I guess from their perspective, this was a big improvement over the more brutal methods they used to use.
Yeah, you have to remember back then the death penalty was just a normal thing, and a lot of people thought finding a more humane way to do it was actually progress.
Right.
But of course, the real test came when they finally used the guillotine on a living person.
So who was the first person to be executed with this new machine?
His name was Nicolas Jacques Pelletier. He was a highwayman convicted of robbery. They took him out to the Place de Grève, the old execution spot in Paris, on a cold April day in 1792. Huge crowds gathered, everyone was curious and nervous. It was a whole new era of executions, and no one knew what was going to happen.
I bet the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife, as Sanson the executioner got Pelletier ready.
It was all very carefully planned out. Sanson cut Pelletier's hair, tied his hands, and then strapped him to the board. It was almost clinical in a way, very different from the chaotic and emotional public executions they used to have.
It seems like the guillotine was designed to get rid of all the drama, the religious stuff, and just replace it with this cold, almost scientific efficiency.
You're right about that. And when everything was set, Sanson put Pelletier's neck under the blade, pulled the lever, and with a thud, the blade came down. People in the crowd were shocked at how fast it was and how little blood there was. It was over in a second.
I bet after all that buildup, it was almost anticlimactic for them. Like they couldn't really grasp what they'd just seen.
One witness said it was like an indivisible point. 1 minute the guy was there, the next he was gone. The guillotine had delivered on its promise of a quick and supposedly painless death.
It's hard to imagine what it must have been like to see that for the first time. And after everyone made fun of him, Dr. Guillotine's idea had actually become a reality. His name would forever be tied to this machine.
It's a strange twist of fate, isn't it? It shows how complicated the guillotine really was. On one hand, you could argue that it was a more humane way to execute people, a product of Enlightenment ideals. But on the other hand,
It set the stage for all the mass executions during the Reign of Terror. It became a symbol of state-sponsored violence on a scale they'd never seen before. We're going to dive into that more in just a bit, but first, a quick word from our sponsors. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're picking up our exploration of the guillotine. Before the break, we were talking about its invention, how it was supposed to be more humane, and that very first execution. But as we know, things took a really dark turn during the French Revolution.
yeah, for sure. It was during the Reign of Terror that the guillotine really became that symbol of revolutionary excess we all think of today.
It's like they invented a machine for efficiency and then handed it to a regime obsessed with fast and brutal justice.
That's a pretty accurate way to put it. During the Terror, they moved the guillotine from the Place de Grève to the Place de la Révolution, which we now know as the Place de la Concorde. It became this chilling reminder of how powerful and ruthless the regime was.
I can't even imagine living in Paris back then, knowing that every day brought more executions. It must have been so heavy psychologically.
Oh, absolutely. The number of people executed during the Terror is just staggering. Thousands of them from all walks of life. Nobles, priests, political opponents, even regular people they suspected of not being loyal enough. It was a time of fear and paranoia where anyone could be next.
And the design of the guillotine, its speed and how detached it was, made it possible to just kill people like it was an assembly line.
Yeah, it's a grim thought. But it shows how dehumanizing the terror was. They just saw people as numbers, their individual stories didn't matter anymore. The guillotine, which was supposed to be a tool of progress, became a symbol of state terror.
And what about Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner? What was his role in all of this?
Well, Sanson, even though he didn't like the idea of mass executions at first, he ended up playing a key role in the terror. He was the one who carried out all those executions, and his records are a chilling reminder of what happened. Can you imagine what that must have been like for him?
He must have seen some truly horrific things every day.
His memoirs give us a glimpse into how emotionally draining his work was, how tired he felt, and the moral weight of killing so many people. He saw countless people die, and even though he was professional about it, you can tell it really weighed on him.
It reminds you that even the people carrying out the violence were still human beings caught in the middle of all this.
You're right, and the irony is that even the people in charge, the ones with all the power, they couldn't escape the guillotine either.
You're talking about the revolutionary leaders themselves, right?
Exactly. People like Danton Robespierre,
Yeah.
even Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, they all ended up under the same blade they used to kill their enemies. It's like a Greek tragedy. The thing that gave them power ended up destroying them.
The guillotine, as a symbol of the revolution, devouring its own children. A reminder that absolute power corrupts and that violence often leads to more violence.
Exactly. The story of the guillotine is all about paradox and contradiction. It was supposed to make the justice system more humane, but it became the symbol of one of the bloodiest chapters in French history.
It's a scary reminder that even the best intentions can go wrong, especially during times of chaos and change.
And its legacy is still with us today. The guillotine might be gone, but the questions it raises about justice, morality, and whether humans are capable of good and evil, those questions are still relevant.
So was the guillotine a force for good or for evil? Or was it both? What do you think?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's a question we all have to think about when we look at history. The guillotine, with its chilling efficiency, reminds us that humans have the potential for both progress and destruction.
That's a really thought-provoking way to end our exploration of the guillotine. It's definitely given me a lot to think about.
Me too. The guillotine story shows us how important it is to always be aware, always question authority, and always try to make sure justice is balanced with mercy.
I like that. And if you enjoyed this journey into the past, make sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more explorations of history's hidden stories. Until next time, keep those minds curious and keep exploring. It's just incredible to think about how a machine made for more humane executions became a symbol of such awful violence. It really makes you wonder how something meant for progress can end up being used for terror.
It really is a tragic irony. The guillotine is like this constant reminder that even when we have good intentions, things can go wrong sometimes in terrible ways. And it's something we still struggle with today, like with capital punishment and the role of technology in our lives.
It definitely gives you pause. The guillotine might be gone,
Yeah.
but the questions it brings up about justice and morals and human nature, those are questions that will always be with us.
I think that's the biggest takeaway from our deep dive into the guillotine. It's not just about a machine or a revolution, it's about us, about how we're capable of both good and evil.
That's a great way to put it. Well, thanks for joining me on this journey into the past. It's been fascinating and a little unsettling exploring one of history's most iconic and controversial inventions.
It was my pleasure. It's always great to dig into these complex historical stories and try to understand what happened.
And to everyone listening, if you found this deep dive as thought-provoking as we did, make sure to subscribe to the deep dive for more explorations of history's hidden stories and the lessons we can learn from them. Until next time, keep those minds curious and keep exploring.